That cold Bristol morning, there wasn't a single loaf of bread, no milk, no oats, nothing. 130 orphan children woke up hungry, and George Müller had nothing to give them. George took a deep breath, gathered the children at the table and said, "Let us give thanks for the food the Lord is going to give us." As the little ones closed their eyes, the sound of a knock echoed at the door. A baker, breathless, told them he had felt in his heart the desire to bake extra bread that night. Minutes later, a milkman appeared. His cart had broken down right in front of the orphanage. The milk needed to be used. Right then. Coincidence? For Müller, that wasn't luck. It was the faithfulness of God. A God who answers prayers and is never late. But what few knew is that this man who now fed thousands had once been a thief, a liar, and a young man imprisoned for fraud and arrogance. Before proving God's faithfulness, he needed to be broken until he trusted him alone. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story set your heart on fire, subscribe now. Every week we bring you new heroes of faith, men and women who were tested in the fire. Because the same God who proved George Müller still sets hearts ablaze with fire. In George Müller's childhood, faith was just a distant sound, something that echoed in quick prayers before meals, but never descended to the heart. Son of a tax collector, he grew up surrounded by coins and calculations, learning early that security meant control. But the boy who counted his father's change also learned to steal from it. Sin began as a whisper, a coin, a pretext, an excuse. Soon it became a habit. By 14, lying was already part of his breathing. He cheated, deceived friends, and spent what didn't belong to him on drink parties and vanities. There was no fear of God, only the impetuous desire to live without limits. The gleam of gold had replaced the light of grace. At 16, the young man his father dreamed of seeing in the pulpit was taken to prison, accused and proven guilty of fraud and misconduct. The cold bars of a cell were the first sermon he heard about God's holiness. There, without preaching, without worship, he began to hear divine silence, the kind of silence that denounces the soul. But Müller didn't convert that day. When he got out, he returned to the same path. The shame didn't transform into repentance. It only hardened him. He entered Halle University to study theology, ironically not out of love for God, but for prestige and salary. Being a pastor was a means of social advancement. The Bible was merely an academic instrument, not a living sword. Until in 1825, a simple invitation changed the course of eternity. A friend called him to a prayer meeting. He accepted, not out of faith, but curiosity, perhaps boredom. In that small room, some young people knelt in silence. There was no rhetoric, no audience, no vanity. They spoke to God as one speaks to a real father. George stood motionless. He had never seen living faith, only religion. There, between sighs and tears, something began to move inside him. God was calling. Pride began to crack like an ancient wall about to crumble. Days later, alone in his room, he knelt. The words came out trembling, "Lord, take my life. I don't want to live for myself anymore." In that moment, the thief was made an intercessor. The rebel became a servant. George Müller stood up different, the same body, but a new heart. It wasn't passing emotion, it was deep conversion. He began to devour the scriptures like a starving man. He spent hours reading and praying, feeling the Spirit illuminate every verse. He discovered that true faith isn't theory, it's living dependence. It was during this period that he made his first radical decision. He refused the religious system that sustained pastors with state money. If God has called me, he thought, he himself will sustain me. From that day on, he never again asked for a fixed salary. He wouldn't ask anything from any man, only from God. He was mocked by colleagues, warned by superiors, called foolish. But the peace he felt was inexplicable. For the first time, he rested not on accounts, but on promises. In 1829, Müller entered the London Missionary Institute. The studies were hard, his health fragile, the money scarce, but his soul burned. It was there that he began recording his prayers, not out of vanity, but as a memorial of God's faithfulness. Each answer became a stone raised in the desert. In his notebooks, he wrote dates, requests, and answers, and when God responded, he marked beside it, "The Lord heard." Later, these records would total thousands of documented answers. His life was beginning to take shape, but faith would still be tested. When resources ceased, he decided to test the very principle he preached. He would pray until God provided. Without asking anyone, he knelt and prayed for bread, rent, and books. Days later, an anonymous envelope arrived with the exact amount. Nothing more, nothing less. It was the first in a series of heavenly confirmations that would shape his ministry. Years later, he would write in his diary, "Faith begins where resources end." George Müller wasn't seeking miracles, he was seeking God. And in seeking him, he discovered that heaven still responds when someone dares to believe. The thief had been redeemed, the vain student transformed into a dependent servant. And the young man who once trusted in coins would now learn to live with empty hands, so that the impossible could fit in them. When George Müller decided he wouldn't receive a salary, few took it seriously. Some called him a fanatic, others a fool. But he knew that faith, when true, needs to be proven. "If God is my Father," he said, "then he knows each of my needs before I speak them." It was with this conviction that, in 1832, newly married to Mary Groves, Müller moved to Bristol, England. The port city was marked by smoke, poverty, and empty churches. Many preachers sought stability. He sought dependence. He took over the pastorate of a small congregation and did something no one expected. He placed an offering box at the entrance and announced, "I will live only on what God moves people's hearts to offer." There were no guarantees, no contracts. Each week he and Mary would kneel to pray for bread, rent, clothes, and answers came, sometimes through letters, sometimes through unknown hands. A coin left discreetly in the box, an anonymous envelope, an unexpected visit. Each gesture was a voice from heaven saying, "I care for you." But it was on the streets of Bristol that Müller's heart broke again. The city was full of orphaned children, abandoned after wars and epidemics, little ones sleeping on cold stones, girls begging for bread. While he preached about God's faithfulness, he couldn't ignore the empty stare of those children. His prayers began to change in tone. "Lord, what can I do to show the world that you are still faithful?" The answer came gentle but unmistakable. "Care for those no one wants." It was there that the seed of Bristol's orphanages was born, one of the greatest faith projects in Christian history. Müller didn't start with money. He started with prayer. For months, he and Mary sought God's direction in fasting and crying out. He recorded each request in his diary, asking for confirmation before taking a step. When he felt peace in his heart, he made a simple prayer. "Lord, if it is your will that I care for orphans, send the resources. I won't ask anything from anyone, only from you." And God answered, without campaigns, without pamphlets, without appeals. In just a few weeks, furniture, food, money, and even the building arrived. Each item was an answer to a specific prayer. In 1836, the first orphanage was opened, a simple house sheltering 30 orphaned girls. George and Mary took care of everything, cooking, cleaning, teaching the Bible. The small home was becoming an altar of daily dependence. But faith that challenges the impossible will always be tested. One morning, the shelves were empty. There was no bread, no milk. Even so, Müller placed the children at the table and said calmly, "Let us give thanks for the food the Lord is going to give us." As they prayed, the sound of a knock at the door interrupted the silence. A baker was there with warm bread. He said he couldn't sleep. God had awakened him to bake extra bread. A few minutes later, a milkman appeared. His cart had broken down right in front of the orphanage, and the milk needed to be used immediately. That day, no one went hungry, and heaven smiled. These events began to multiply. Needs increased, and so did the answers. Müller recorded everything with almost scientific precision. Over the years, he recorded more than 50,000 answered prayers, 30,000 in less than 24 hours. The diaries became public testimony of God's faithfulness. "Faith that isn't tested," he said, "is faith that cannot be approved." The news began to spread. Visitors came from various places to see that man who never asked but never lacked. Some sought inspiration, others explanation. But Müller never sought fame. "I don't want to be remembered as a man of faith," he said. "I want them to see that God is still trustworthy." The orphanage grew. More children arrived, more beds were needed, more bread, more clothes, more space. Each new need was a new altar. He prayed and waited, and always, somehow, the answer came. It was as if God himself wanted to prove through one man that he still governs the impossible. As Müller's faith matured, his theology simplified. God speaks through his word, answers through prayer, and manifests through providence. He didn't wait for feelings. He waited for direction. Years later, he would write, "When I understood that the Bible is the food of the inner man and that prayer is the breathing of the soul, my life changed forever." The former young thief now sustained orphans, shepherded hearts, and inspired faith around the world. But the journey was only beginning. The challenges would grow, and with them God's glory would become even more visible. The following years in Bristol seemed to defy the laws of logic. The small home of 30 girls had become a ministry that touched the world. Each answered prayer seemed to feed the next. It was as if God had found, in a simple man, an unobstructed channel through which his faithfulness could flow freely. Müller wasn't eloquent, nor did he seek popularity. He was simply constant. He prayed with the same fervor for a shilling as for 1,000 pounds. And as faith grew, so did the orphanages. A second building, then a third. In a few years, 5 large houses were erected in Ashley Down, each one fruit of prayer, without campaigns, without debts, without requests. In total, more than 10,000 orphans would be cared for, fed, clothed, and instructed in Scripture, without Müller asking a penny from anyone. In every account, God supplied every detail: bread, firewood, clothes, medicine, ink, even simple toys. And not just for the orphans. Many employees were also sustained by the same living faith. But while miracles accumulated, criticism also grew. Some accused him of spiritual vanity. Why not use the money for missions abroad? Why challenge the system? Others doubted the truthfulness of answered prayers, but Müller didn't argue. He responded with the same silence that a man who trusts God learns to cultivate. He knew that God's work doesn't need human defense. He let the facts speak. And they spoke loudly. With each need supplied, a new faith was born among those who observed. Pastors, missionaries, and revivalists sought him out. Hudson Taylor, Charles Spurgeon, D.L. Moody, Evan Roberts, all left marked. Spurgeon even said, "George Müller is a modern Enoch, a man who walks with God." But faith didn't spare him from pain. The orphan house prospered, but the servant's home was shaken. Mary, his beloved wife, fell gravely ill after 39 years of marriage and departed. Müller, then 64 years old, was alone. But his prayer recorded that day became one of the most beautiful declarations of submission ever written. "The Lord is good and does good. He gave me my beloved wife, and he himself took her. I am satisfied with my Father's will." These words, written beside the empty bed, are the portrait of a man who had learned to trust not only in the gifts, but in the giver. Even widowed, Müller didn't stop. He married again, Susanna, a friend of deep faith, and together they continued the ministry with the same devotion. He prayed before each decision, seeking not emotion, but confirmation. He used to say, 9/10 of difficulties are overcome when the heart is willing to do God's will, whatever it may be. At 70, when many would rest, George Müller began a new journey. He traveled the world preaching the gospel. Over 200,000 miles traveled, without airplanes, without luxury, only with the Bible in hand and the brightness of eternity in his eyes. He visited 42 countries, speaking in churches, universities, and squares. In Quebec once, the ship he was on was held back by dense fog. The captain said it would be impossible to arrive in time for the conference. Müller smiled and replied, "Captain, the Lord who sent me can also remove the fog." He went down to the cabin and prayed briefly. When he stood up, the captain wanted to pray too, but Müller answered, "No, you don't need to. God has already answered." When they went back up, the sky was clear. The captain, until then an unbeliever, converted. For Müller, that wasn't a spectacular miracle. It was just one more answer from the Father. As the years passed, his body aged, but his faith didn't. At 90, he still preached with youthful vigor. His trembling hands leafed through the same Bible he had read more than 200 times, half of them on his knees. He said, "The word is the food of the soul, and prayer is the breathing of inner life." The man who once stole coins was now returning to the world an invaluable treasure, the testimony that God continues to be the same. His body bent, but his spirit remained upright before the throne. And when the hour finally came, in 1898, at 92 years old, George Müller departed as he lived, in peace, sustained by prayer. That day, Bristol stopped. Stores closed, factories fell silent, and the streets filled with people weeping. Believers and unbelievers united in respect. The local newspaper wrote, "George Müller was raised up by God to prove that the age of miracles has not ended." But for Müller, they weren't miracles. They were just normal answers from a faithful father to a son who dared to believe. George Müller departed in silence, but his faith never ceased to speak. More than 10,000 orphans had been cared for, 123,000 students educated, and millions of people, directly or indirectly, reached by the testimony of answered prayer. The records of the institute he founded, the Scriptural Knowledge Institution, created in 1834, still document today the impossible made routine. 1. £5 million received and distributed during his lifetime, without a single request made to any human being. In current values, more than £100 million, every penny coming through faith, and faith alone. After his death, the work didn't die. The Müller Institute continues active today, sending resources to missionaries, caring for orphans, and promoting Christian education in various countries. More than a century later, the Bristol faith continues feeding people Müller never knew. The same God who heard his prayers still hears ours. But Müller's legacy wasn't the money, nor the buildings, nor the statistics. It was the lived theology of absolute trust. He taught that faith isn't demanding that God do, but resting in what he has already promised to do. For him, each need was a chance to see God's character more clearly. And that vision, more than any bread or milk, is what truly sustained his soul. Once, a young man asked him, "Mr. Müller, what would you do differently if you could start over?" He answered with the same serene brightness that accompanied him to the end, "I would trust sooner." This is the core of his life, the simplicity of faith that believes before seeing. Müller didn't seek to be a hero, only an obedient son. And by living this way, he became a lighthouse for all who desire to prove that God is still enough. Today, while the world chases guarantees, contracts, and visibility, George Müller's life remains as a living parable. He proved that there is no freer heart than one that depends entirely on God, and there is no more powerful prayer than one made in secret when only heaven listens. His diaries, more than 2,000 handwritten records, still echo like modern psalms. Each page carries the weight of practical faith, the fragrance of a broken heart. There is no rhetoric there, only gratitude. Today, he wrote in 1874, God supplied even before I asked. It seems that the Heavenly Father delights in anticipating the needs of his children. There's no way to read these lines without feeling the same call to return to the secret room, to bend the knees, to ask less and trust more. Because George Müller's God hasn't changed. There is still bread for those who believe. There is still milk on the table for those who wait. And there are still miracles hidden in the routine of those who learn to pray with simplicity. Müller said, "Faith begins where resources end." The beginning of anxiety is the end of faith, and the beginning of faith is the end of anxiety. These phrases, written almost 200 years ago, continue cutting through time like swords. And perhaps this is the question that echoes to us today. Do you still believe God can answer? That the same Father who sustained orphans in Bristol can care for your life, your home, your tomorrow? George Müller's faith doesn't fit in a museum. It asks for space in the heart. And every time someone prays without reservations, every time they trust without seeing, his testimony revives. Before departing, Müller wrote a final confession. My joy is knowing that God is faithful, always faithful, and that he will not fail me at the end, just as he never failed along the way. It was with that confidence that he fell asleep and awoke in eternity. And if there's something that George Müller's life still shouts through the centuries, it is this: God doesn't need great men, only men who believe in him completely.